a lot bigger than that. One more story I'd like to relate. One more final lie that I feel is needed to come out. So I was listening to Ron Engelman's show, the final day, the day of the raid when they're tear gassing us, sending in these canisters. I was listening to Mr. Engelman, and he was asking us to come out, pleading with us, because he knew that the government wasn't going to give up, that they weren't going to stop, and we knew it too. But we knew one thing. They had promised us the 7 seal manuscript to be written, and we were not going to go out into the hands of them until we had some security, some insurance. So if we were to leave, the building wouldn't meet like an accident like this. We wanted the truth to come out. That was one of the reasons this document was our safeguard. So when they asked us to come out, we didn't. We stayed, as did other communities, as did the Indians at Wounded Knee. They stayed for what they believed in. They ended up dying for what they believed in. But I'm sitting there that morning, and Ron Engelman, he goes to a news brief. He goes to a commercial, and they have a news brief. And I'm sitting there listening to this news brief, and I remember all morning being blown away that here's this tear gas being jettisoned into the complex, and people are reading their Bibles. People are asking God for guidance. People are supplementing themselves unto God at the very last moments. And I hear this report come on saying the FBI is now assaulting the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. And they're sending in tear gas, hoping to get the people out. And the FBI have received 80 to 200 gunshots on their CEVs. And due to the credit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they had not fired back. Now when I heard that, my jaw dropped. My heart sank to the bottom of my stomach. And an immediate feeling of foreboding came upon me like I could never describe to any of you, because I could see the writing on the wall. I don't recall hearing one shot that whole morning ever fired at the CEVs. For one thing, the people in there weren't stupid enough to think that a pitiful little .223 round would ever be able to go through a tank, an armored vehicle, armored plated that even .50 caliber weapons wouldn't pierce. No one was that stupid. Number two, we wanted to work it out peacefully, even in the very ending moments. We wanted it to end peacefully. We were hoping for negotiations. So I was amazed at the composure of the people inside there, and it strengthened my faith. But when I heard that report, I saw the writing on the wall. I knew we were condemned. I knew we were dead. I knew they were setting the American public up for a massacre. And that's what they got. They got a massacre. There's the rubble. Julie Martinez should be here. Isaiah and Joseph should be here. Julie's mother's sitting out in the audience. She's been devastated by this. She's one of the most wonderful women I've ever known. Julie's mom. Those kids were the most wonderful kids I've ever known and ever will know. There's no excuse for me not to be with them. I just want to say one more thing. Kind of show you the mentality of where our government's going, where our nation is. About the same time Mount Carmel was happening, there was a siege in Canada taking place. The Canadian government, over a land dispute, went in to take some property from some Indians that hadn't had it legally. And the Indians held their ground. These are Canadian Indians. And this siege lasted for 51 days. I'm sorry, for 71 days, excuse me. And this siege was compared to Waco, Texas. It was a documentary that was comparing the crime in Toronto to the crime in Detroit, two cities that are very close together, only because they're under different governments. They have a totally different outlook on crime and criminal activity. The Canadian government said in this documentary that they waited these people out. They waited 71 days, and they ended it peacefully. And those Indians came out peacefully. And they're still here to live to tell about their story. And the Canadian government said of the American government, we would never, never have done to our people what you all did to your people down there in Waco, Texas. We would never have done it. We would have waited till the last man, woman, and child had come out. Janet Reno, Jeff Jamar, Bob Ricks, Byron Sage, Davey Aguilera, all these spirits that have joined together in their pride and their arrogancy, who would not listen to the psychologists, who would not listen to the theologians, who would listen to no one but themselves, out of their own pride and arrogances, got these people killed. Hook, line, and sinker. Pride and arrogancy, the one thing that Scripture warns mankind about over and over again, to have a humble spirit. To be able to listen to other people's views and viewpoints. To be able to have an understanding from professionals as to how to deal with these kind of situations. I hope in the future we deal with these kind of situations in wisdom and not in ignorance, and not with a militaristic style mentality that our government has used against its own citizens. We've seen it in Panama, we've seen it in Nicaragua, and now we're seeing it right here on good old American soil. Where are we headed? What are we headed for? I hope we live through this. I hope this doesn't happen to your church. I hope it doesn't happen to you. I'm praying for you. One last thing. There's a new video out. It's by Richard Mosley. I had the opportunity to view it last night with Ron Engelman and a number of the survivors. And it is the most thought-provoking, informative video I've seen yet on Waco, Texas. Unlike certain other people that have put out videos and made thousands and thousands of dollars off this tragedy, he's actually interviewed the survivors, and all the proceeds go to the survivors. The documentary is the most professional thing I've ever seen. It's actually, as I said, interviewed the survivors, and you get a much, much clearer grasp from the other side of what happened truly here at Mount Carmel. He's got a booth over here. His name's Richard Mosley. The video is called Day 51, and it's incredible. I think a lot of you would enjoy it. It's not out yet, but you can get on a mailing list for it, and I think everybody needs to see this video. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out, and write letters. Don't stop. Don't let the pressure off on this government. They want you to forget about it. They want you to go to football games. They want you to go to pizza joints. They want you to watch Beavis and Butthead. They want you to play video games. They want you to have your mind on everything but what happened here at Mount Carmel. We can't allow that to happen. No longer can we be ignorant. No longer can we be stupid. We have to fight fire with fire. We have to fight deceit with truth. Well, I don't have to tell lies. I don't have to get up here and lie. I can tell the truth and damn the government. They have to tell lies to damn us. What's fair? Thank you.
You know, I don't know what else can be said. There was somebody that was there for the entire 51 days, actually living there for 2.5 years. Our next speaker is Harley Schlanger. And I had Harley on my radio program 2 or 3 times during the siege, and we were talking about some outside influences other than just the government. Mr. Schlanger is the Southwest Bureau Chief of the Executive Intelligence Review. He's written a lot of letters and articles on matters relating to First Amendment rights, including a series of articles in the national newspaper New Federalist on the Waco tragedy. He's co-author of the book The Ugly Truth About the ADL. Now it's in its 5th printing. Harley Schlanger ran in the Democratic Party primary for U.S. Senate in Texas for Phil Graham's seat in 1990. He received 250,000 votes. He'll speak here today on the role of the so-called cult experts in the Waco tragedy, which will focus on the notorious Cult Awareness Network. And if we watched any television during the 51-day siege, you saw Mr. Rick Ross. Here now, Harley Schlanger.
Thank you, Ron, and I'd like to commend all of you for coming here today. I'd like to take you back before day 1 to give you a sense of some of the motivation behind the people who ran the operation that ended up with the tragedy here outside of Waco, Texas. There's a lot of blame that should be placed correctly on the FBI, on the ATF, and on the Justice Department, because these agencies have become corrupted. But I want to give you a sense of who did the corrupting, because there are individuals with names who are responsible for what happened here and similar actions throughout the United States. Let me first take you back to October 6, 1986, in the sleepy town of Leesburg, Virginia, about 40 miles outside of Washington, D.C. This is in 1986 now, where an interagency task force of over 400 heavily armed individuals with tanks, with helicopters from the FBI, the ATF, the Secret Service, National Guard, local and state police and sheriff's department descended on a small farm outside of town. The target at that time was a man named Lyndon LaRouche. The ATF and the people running that operation intended to kill him and burn down the farm, precisely as was done not too far from where we're meeting today. He survived that day because he sent a telegram to Ronald Reagan and said, "If I die, then my blood is on your hands." And because of certain aspects of Reagan at that time, Reagan called off the troops, the siege was lifted, but the railroad continued until Mr. LaRouche ended up serving 5 years in prison on the charge conspiracy to defraud the Internal Revenue Service. Any of you familiar with those kind of charges? Now, what was it that brought 400 troops that day to Leesburg, Virginia? What was it that made the town of Waco at the center of national attention for 4 months in the early part of 1993? What we're facing in this country, which is the most dangerous threat to our freedom of all, is a small collection of entities who call themselves cult experts. These are the anti-cult networks. Now, I want to take my time today to brief you on who they are and how they operate. Because if we do not stop them, then what we saw happen in Waco will be a prelude to a much larger assault on anybody who maintains a belief that there are issues that are right and wrong, and to anybody who has a deep religious belief. Those are the people who are being targeted. Now, the Cult Awareness Network is known through, as Ron Engelman told you, a man named Rick Ross. Rick Ross was involved in a so-called deprogramming of a member of the Branch Davidian Church. Do you know what deprogramming is? It's a fancy name for brainwashing. It's the way in which a so-called professional carries out a torture procedure until the individual victim is forced to recant their beliefs. And then they're put on television and put before the media to tell their story about how they were a victim of a cult. Now let's take a look first at Rick Ross. Rick Ross, the so-called expert. You saw him on television. He was paid money by Channel 4 in Dallas to be their expert on the cult here outside of Waco. What is Rick Ross's area of expertise? Well, in 1975, Rick Ross was convicted of a jewel theft. He's a jewel robber. He did a plea bargain and got off. Does that give him expertise in understanding so-called cults? Rick Ross got caught up with something called the Cult Awareness Network. The Cult Awareness Network was created in the 1970s, but it goes back before that. The Cult Awareness Network comes out of something called Operation MK Ultra. Now, if you know your history, in the 1950s, the CIA was doing mind control experiments out in California, in Canada. And they hired a bunch of so-called psychiatrists to find out, how can you break people's beliefs? How can you take someone and force them to change their identity? They were using drugs. This is when LSD was first being used in the United States. They were using shock therapy, something called sleep therapy, hypnotic therapy. This was all under grants of the Central Intelligence Agency. Two of the key people involved in this were a man named Lewis West and Margaret Singer. You may know the name Margaret Singer because she was on national television trying to explain the so-called cult of the Branch Davidians. These people think they have a right to say what is normal, what is legitimate belief. They think that they can tell you whether you're normal or a cultist. And they start from the following simple definition, that anybody who has a deep, profound belief is subject to being brainwashed by an authoritarian personality. Now, by that definition, any person who is a good Christian is potentially considered brainwashed, especially if you try to convince others that your belief is right. If you try to convince people there are universal laws, there is a higher morality than the day-to-day hedonistic existence that we have. If you believe that, then you are considered brainwashed by the Cult Awareness Network. Now, the Cult Awareness Network has hired a number of people, like Rick Ross, like a man named Galen Kelly, who was convicted of kidnapping. And for those of you who wish to see justice, let me tell you that some of these people are being caught one at a time, but we need to get out the story on this kidnapping operation so that the whole operation is shut down. The Cult Awareness Network does between 500 and 1,500 kidnappings a year. They make between $15,000 and $50,000 per kidnapping. So if you have a son or a daughter that joins an organization, whether it's a devoutly religious Christian organization or a political party, there's an opportunity that this Cult Awareness Network will move in, convince the family that this child has been taken over by a dangerous cult, and make money by kidnapping the child and carrying out traumatic psychological conditioning. Now, one of the founders of the Cult Awareness Network is a man from the Tavistock Institute in London named John Rawlings Rees. He's one of the intellectual founders of this. And he said that what we need in this country are psychiatric shock troops to enforce the normal. Again, what do they mean by normal? If you reject the counterculture, the rock, drug, sex counterculture, you're considered abnormal by this. You can begin to see why it was that the Branch Davidians were considered a cult. By rejecting the idea of this rock, drug, sex counterculture, by starting from the notion that there's a higher morality, that there are universal laws, the members of the Branch Davidians were considered to be abnormal outside of the mainstream. Now, the unholy trinity here starts with the brainwashers, the Cult Awareness Network. Secondly, the role of the media, and I'm sad to see some of the media running off right now because we have to hold the media to account. Who was it who spread the story? Every time you saw the name David Koresh, you saw the word cult. Every time you see the name Lyndon LaRouche, you see the word political extremist as though it's in the computer. You type in the name and automatically it appears. They're telling everyone in this country what's legitimate to be believed and what's not right. That is not the role of the media. And we cannot allow the media to pervert the life, the social, daily, political, public life in this country. Who authorized the Waco newspaper to say what's right and what's wrong? Where did they get that story? The main source for the Waco stories that triggered this was the brainwasher Rick Ross. Somebody ought to ask Mark Masferer and the other people who wrote the story and the editors of the Waco paper why they accepted the lies of a convicted jewel thief who was recently arrested again in Washington State for kidnapping a member of a Christian group. Why they printed his lies and gave them credibility when they could have come out here and interviewed people who lived right over there, could have interviewed them and asked them what they truly believed. So the second group of this holy trinity or unholy trinity is the media. And then it gets to the third, which is the Justice Department and the corrupt agencies that people have been discussing. Let me just tell you about two of these groups. One is called the Hostage Response Team, and the other is called the Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico, Virginia, which is an FBI agency. There were 3 members from this group who read 2 letters from David Koresh and concluded from those 2 letters that Koresh was going to burn down the compound, the home over here, that Koresh was not coming out, that he was suicidal, and that everyone in there would probably die because of him. They read 2 letters. This is the kind of psychological shock troop we're talking about. This behavioral sciences unit took it upon itself to come up with the argument that this, in fact, was a cult that was committed to a Jonestown-style suicide. And so how did they decide to treat that? By sending in the tanks, as you've just heard David Thibodeau describe very eloquently, that they decided they had the right to save people from themselves. Those of you who are old enough to remember the Vietnam War may remember when that lunatic Defense Secretary Robert McNamara once said, "We had to destroy the city to save it." Well, that's the mentality we see, shaped by this idea of what's right and what's wrong, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Now, the problem that we have is that this is what's shaping the thinking of our government and our law enforcement agencies. The Cult Awareness Network works very closely with an organization called the Anti-Defamation League. I've been researching the Anti-Defamation League for years. I've written a book that's available over here on the ADL. They think they have a right to tell government what's right and what's wrong. In San Francisco, California, they recently discovered that the ADL was keeping files illegally, police files, of more than 20,000 individuals in 950 organizations. That they were spying on organizations. Now, about 5 months ago, I heard Oliver Buck Revell, the FBI station chief up in Dallas, give a talk on how the FBI uses these kinds of groups. And Revell said, by law, we are no longer allowed to spy on organizations. Now, it's true, by law they're not, but he's lying. They still do. The FBI still does. But Revell said, we encourage groups like the Anti-Defamation League and the Cult Awareness Network to spy on groups for us, to bring us evidence of potential crimes, then we get involved. This, my friends, is a police state, but one which starts not at the FBI, not at the White House, although they aren't doing anything about it, and they are culpable because of that. But it starts with these private agencies with their own political and religious agenda. Their agenda is to destroy the notion that all human beings are created in the image of God. They believe that that is a fraudulent notion. The Anti-Defamation League financed the legal case in 1962 that removed prayer from the schools. This is the kind of group that's connected with the Scottish Rite Freemasons and something called the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. The group that's trying to convince our country that if you have a belief in God, you should not ever express it to anyone else for risk of being labeled a cultist. And we see what they do to people they label cultists. Now, the lesson for us is that if we do not address this problem in this country, then we will see many, many more Wacos. One of the leaders of the Cult Awareness Network in Houston said, in fact, right after the fire here, that there will be many more fires in the months and years ahead because there are too many of those crazy people running around out there who refuse to abide by the norms of society. In other words, their norms. It remains to us, the living who are here today, to ensure in our commemoration here that these lives were. It remains to us to ensure that we take our country back from these individuals, these brainwashers, these so-called psychiatrists, these so-called cult experts, who think they have a right to tell you what you can believe and how you can practice your beliefs. I have a book that I brought with me, which is taken from the tapes, the FBI tapes of one of these kidnappings. The FBI was planning to kidnap a man named Louis DuPont Smith, the heir to the DuPont family fortune. They were going to kidnap him because he gave $100,000 of his money to print a book that was written by Lyndon LaRouche. They were planning a kidnapping, they were caught, and they were acquitted in a trial by a corrupt judge. As I said, fortunately, the same group was caught a few months later. They kidnapped the wrong girl. They kidnapped someone in Washington, D.C., drove her 15 miles outside of Washington. They rolled her up in a rug in the back of a van, They pulled up at a hotel, they opened the rug, dumped the girl out, and the mother looked at her and said, "That's not my daughter." They drove her back to Washington, all the way threatening to kill her if she said anything. She went to the police, and Galen Kelly, who's the #1 kidnapper for the Cult Awareness Network, is now in prison for 7 years. But for every conviction of a Galen Kelly, there are people like Rick Ross wandering around this country, soliciting parents, using the media to make money to carry out kidnapping and brainwashing and to organize law enforcement to carry out acts such as we saw in this city. And that's what we have to stop. And I encourage you to get the most information you can and take it out to everyone, including the thousands of people who should be here but are not here. Let's make sure that the United States sees an end to these kinds of practices in our lifetime, if not immediately. So thank you very much.
He's a PhD. He's a professor at Baylor University. He's the director of the J.M. Dawson Institute, and he is going to discuss the religious implications of the ATF raid. And I think that's something that we all want to know about. Please welcome Professor James Wood from Baylor.
I'm really pleased to be a part of the observance of this day, and indeed the commemoration, if that is such a word, at least a day of remembrance of what happened a year ago. There are others here, and I certainly want to respect some schedule to permit them. So if I may just immediately go and make the kind of statement that I feel is particularly appropriate for this occasion. A year ago, as all of us will remember, for 51 days, the drama of the Branch Davidian standoff in Central Texas was given daily coverage by the media throughout the world. From the very time of the assault on the Branch Davidian compound on Sunday morning, the 28th of February, 1993, by approximately 100 federal agents, during which 4 agents and 6 Branch Davidians within the compound were killed, and 16 agents and an indeterminate number of Branch Davidians were wounded, to the drama's fateful, fiery climax on Monday, the 19th of April, in which at least 86 persons in the compound, including 17 children, lost their lives. The flow of news stories remained constant throughout the world. Daily reports were released by the press, radio, and television, with feature stories, indeed feature cover stories, appearing in the most widely distributed weekly news magazines: Time, Newsweek, U.S. News World Report. From the very beginning, the confrontation between federal agents and the Branch Davidians provoked, then as now, a storm of controversy and acrimonious debate. It should be kept in mind today, as perhaps even more than during the past year, that the Branch Davidians had not been charged with any crime. The initial assault by approximately 100 armed agents of the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms on the compound, occupied by a little more than 100 Branch Davidians, more than half of whom were children and women, was itself an unprecedented government action in the history of this country against a religious group. A powerful chemical on that last day, used by the FBI on the very final day of the standoff, chemical referred to generally as CS, raised further questions as to the methods employed by the federal government in its assault on a religious community, the Branch Davidians. The fine white powder chemical was blown into the compound for approximately 6 hours. That chemical is banned for United States military use. Indeed, early in 1993, that chemical was banned in Paris by more than 100 nations who took action, including the United States. Indeed, that chemical has been declared by Amnesty International to be particularly dangerous when launched directly into homes or other buildings. One weapons expert, Paul Hovind, charged that he doubted that with the use of CS, that members of the compound had any way possible to find their way out. Exposed to CS, to quote Paul Hovind, I doubt that they would have been able to run and to get the children. Certainly the children would have been out of control. It would be, under any circumstance, a very difficult situation. End of quotation. All the more puzzling was the government's stated purpose for this type of military operation, namely, to issue a search warrant to David Koresh to determine if his religious community, which had no history of committing acts of violence or manifesting hostile resistance to government authority, was in possession of illegal weapons, namely fully automatic weapons. Many have asked, then and now, why was it necessary to have approximately 100 armed agents encircle a religious compound with 3 armed helicopters overhead to issue a search warrant or even a warrant for arrest of the leader, simply the leader, not the group, the leader of a religious community? At the time of the assault on the Branch Davidian compound, relatively few persons outside of Central Texas and members of the families associated with this religious community knew much of the Branch Davidians. But by the end of the standoff, perhaps few could deny some awareness of this religious community, even if its religious identity remained unknown to all but a very few. The armed clash between the Branch Davidians and ATF rightly provoked widespread controversy and debate, not only throughout the United States, but throughout the world. In some countries resistant to guarantees of religious rights and guarantees of religious liberty, the incident was used as a reminder of what may happen in a nation like the United States, which permits a wide array of religious associations without government certification and government jurisdiction. During the time of the standoff, in registering from Waco at a Moscow hotel facing Red Square, I was immediately asked by the hotel clerk at that hotel, "What is religion like in Waco?" The shock of that tragedy that resulted from the Branch Davidian standoff was compounded for many because it involved a religious community with which they had no acquaintance and was therefore entirely unknown. In the face of the tragedy that resulted from the confrontation between this almost unknown religious community and the federal government, the question naturally arises for many people still, who were the Branch Davidians? From the beginning, the Branch Davidians, as the Davidians from which they originally held to this a radical separation from the world of unbelievers, and to a radical apocalyptic belief in the imminent second coming of Christ and the approaching Battle of Armageddon. Indeed, it may be said that the Davidians, as well as the Branch Davidians, were a people focused on the second coming and the end of time. This, of course, is not the time or place to review the distinct teachings of this religious community. But I mention this identity because it is right and proper here to affirm that basic to the First Amendment is the guarantee of the equality of all religious communities before the law. Let us reaffirm here today that the First Amendment exists It serves to protect all religions, old and new, conventional and non-conventional, popular and unpopular, against government harassment, intrusion, and discrimination. Indeed, in the words of the United States Supreme Court, delivered 122 years ago in a very famous case, the court declared, "The law knows no heresy, is committed to the support of no dogma, the establishment of no sect, the right to organize voluntary religious associations to assist in the expression and dissemination of any religious doctrine, and for the ecclesiastical government of all the individual members, congregations, and officers within the general association," that is the religious community, "is unquestioned." 50 years ago, similarly, the Supreme Court declared that no agency of the state has the competence or the power to determine, and I quote again the court, "the truth or falsity of beliefs or doctrines, or anyone, even though those beliefs may be viewed by outsiders as incredible, if not preposterous to most people." Many of us are here today because we believe that the denial of religious rights and religious liberty to any one group is a threat to the religious liberty of all groups. And the corollary that to abridge the religious right of any one religious adherent is to imperil the rights of all religious adherents. For this reason, if for no other, no religion can be denied the protection of the First Amendment simply because its beliefs are non-conventional or even socially at variance with the religious majority. In the first real church-state decision of the United States Supreme Court on the religion clauses, 1878, the court looked to one of its founding fathers, James Madison, the architect of the First Amendment. And the court noted that in the preamble of James Madison's memorial and remonstrance, religious freedom is there defined. And after recital of the act of James Madison, the court went on to say that to suffer the civil magistrate to intrude his powers into the field of religious opinion and to restrain the profession or propagation of principles on the supposition of their ill tendency is a dangerous fallacy which at once destroys religious liberty. The court continued, "It is time enough for the rightful purposes of civil government for its officers to interfere when principles break out into overt acts against peace and good order." In these two sentences, the court declared, is found the true distinction between what properly belongs to the church and what properly belongs to the state. End of quotation. There are surely lessons to be learned from the tragedy of the Branch Davidian standoff. First and foremost, there is a need for government agencies to take seriously and to try to understand religious beliefs held by a religious group whenever they may be brought into any kind of church-state confrontation, particularly where there is the potential use of force that may be involved. The principle is one that must be applied even when to outsiders the beliefs of any given religious group may appear to be, as I've said earlier, incredible or even preposterous. Government agencies would do well not to rely, as they did in the case of the Branch Davidians, on so-called cult experts and deprogrammers whose one purpose is to discredit the religious claims of non-conventional and unpopular religious groups and thereby promote religious intolerance and religious discrimination against them. Last year, living in this community, I was more than offended. I was incensed by the repeated references in the press and the media at large to members of the Cult Awareness Network, CAN, and portraying them as experts to the newer and non-conventional religions of America. Indeed, to call members of that network experts, I would say, is both misleading and deplorable. The fact is that members of the Cult Awareness Network have a history of persecution of members of groups they deem to be, quote, cults. Actions of federal agencies from the beginning confirmed for the Branch Davidians their adversarial relationship with the outside world, fueled even further by their strong belief that the end of time and the Battle of Armageddon are near. The precipitous action of the ATF in its raid on the compound not only raised serious constitutional questions about the abuse of federal authority, but proved, as we know, to be counterproductive. In fact, it may well be argued that the actions of the ATF and the FBI provoked a radical response in view of the very beliefs of the Branch Davidians. Since David Koresh was looked upon as the Messiah by his followers, as one professor observed, to come out with your hands up is not what a Messiah is supposed to do. There was little indication that government officials either understood or took seriously the beliefs and religious claims of the Branch Davidians. In any event, merely to suspect a religious group to be in violation of firearms laws cannot justify the severity with which the government acted against David Koresh and his followers. As long as a religious group operates within the confounds of civil and criminal law, even though their teachings may be viewed by others as radically non-conventional and even socially unacceptable to the mainstream of society, the teachings and practices of that group are simply irrelevant to their full constitutional rights and their full religious freedom. Amen. As an editorial in the Los Angeles Times rightly observed, if the state had intervened elsewhere in the world against a religious group, as occurred here at the Branch Davidian compound, it would have been reported in the United States press and media as an act of oppression. Even, the editorial continued, even if David Koresh were to be judged a maniac, there is no good excuse for what happened. Prattling on about thought control and deprogramming, profiling its leader as a nutcase and his followers as social misfits, simply does not alter the fact. Although there is no attempt being made here on my part to justify violence, in this case, any actions of the Branch Davidians in committing acts of violence against ATF agents, both at the beginning and at the end of the 51-day standoff, far too little attention was given by both federal agents and the media to the circumstances of the assault against a religious group that had not been charged with any crime and had no history of any acts of physical violence. Constitutional church-state issues were virtually obscured by the repeated use of the term cult by both government officials and the media to justify government action against a cult phenomenon. May I pause here to say that the very term cult, which invariably is directed at a religious group other than one's own, and a group with which one always disapproves, has no place in American public law or American jurisprudence, and does not belong in the vocabulary of any public official. The tragedy of the Branch Davidian standoff had hardly come to an end before there were calls for a government investigation of cults. And such a broad government inquiry as that should and must be always resisted. To do otherwise is to raise serious constitutional questions and to ignore the restraint that prohibits government action short of probable cause. Government action against a religious group cannot be predicated upon that group's being non-conventional, and I repeat, unpopular or socially disapproved. Any confrontation between government and any religious community which has no history of acts of violence and is not specifically charged with committing a crime does not warrant military action against that group on any scale. The use of force should come on the part of government only as a last resort. Indeed, these concluding words of a feature article in Newsweek are words with which I would like to conclude my remarks here. Namely, that unless the feds learn to deal astutely and carefully with non-conventional religions, the tragedy of the Branch Davidians is a tragedy that could occur again. Let us all say, never, never again. Thank you.
You know, during this 51-day siege, I came down here to do my show on March the 10th. I was going to do it live from what became known as Satellite City. And while I was in there, a couple of the news media people came up to me and said, the ATF are looking for you. And I said, for what? And he said, they're going to tell you to leave, and if you don't leave, they're going to make us all move back another 4 or 5 miles to where no one will have any view whatsoever of Mount Carmel or what's going here, regardless what kind of cameras we have. Rather than allow the government to get the media totally out of their sight to where they would be able to do any and everything that they wanted to do, which they ended up doing anyway, I voluntarily left. The next day in the newspaper, a TV newsman that was down here was quoted in the newspaper, wouldn't allow himself to be identified, called me a nut and said that I was going to get people killed. Well, as far as I'm concerned, it was the lapdog media that did that, because all they did is sit on their butts here 24.5 hours a day, and then for 30 minutes went down to a press conference in Waco at the convention center. The FBI and the ATF would get up there and make their little speeches and tell you what a damned person David Koresh was and how idiotic his followers were, what his demands were, that he's saying, let's get it on, we want to, you want us, you come and get us. That was nothing more than one simple thing that's called siege mentality. It comes upon some people that are under siege within 2 days, some people 2 weeks, some people 2 months. But eventually what happens is if you're in this siege mentality, you realize you're not going to get out of here alive. So what you want to do is get it over with. So if David did in fact make those statements, that's what it was. It was a siege mentality in which he was saying, come on, you want to kill me, you're going to kill me anyway, why don't you start doing it right now and let's get it over with. But the media sat down there at the Waco Press Center, at the convention center, every day for 30 minutes, and then they'd ask Bob Ricks and Kalorian and Royster and the rest of the ATF and FBI spokesmen. They'd ask them stupid, inane questions. Nobody asked any probing questions. Nobody but one person, and that person asked whether this type of action was an indication of the police state that this country is becoming. He was escorted out of there and never allowed back in. The rest of the media sat there waiting for their little doggy treats every day, then came back on television and primped themselves up for their little 30-minute piece that they were going to do on the news that evening. And all they did is sit there and verbatim everything that the government said all of a sudden became fact. They didn't question anything. It was all fact. Nobody believed that there could be two sides to this story. Nobody believed that the government could be lying. I believed that they could be lying. We've proved that they were lying, and they're going to continue to lie. They're not going to stop. This is just a precursor of things to come. Somebody says, well, who's next? Well, I don't know who's next, but after the botched job they did here, they better do a hell of a lot of practicing before they decide to go up to Montana and get Guru Ma, Claire Prophet, Church Universal and Triumphant, because I think personally that they are on the list. And I think Claire Prophet knows it, and I think everybody up there knows it. And I don't think the government at this point, if this is an indication of how good they are at what they do, they're going to go up there and really get their butts beat. We've got to continue on with our program. Thank you. Continue on with our program, and we have a lot of PhDs here today, very intelligent people that that know what went on, and are not sitting still and saying nothing, just as James Wood just did from Baylor University. I'd like to introduce to you a gentleman, a professor of religion at Texas Christian University, and he is going to talk to us about the concepts of the free exercise clause. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. PhD Ron Flowers. Ron?
I've never been introduced as Mr. PhD before. Thank you very much. My friends, the religion clauses of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States say as follows: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We are here today to celebrate or to mourn an event that involves primarily the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. And my assignment today is to talk with you a little bit about how that clause has been interpreted throughout the years since the founding of this nation. I want to say at the outset that I agree with my colleague Jim Wood, my good friend Jim Wood from Baylor, completely in what he said a few minutes ago. In some ways his act is a very difficult act to follow because he said some of the things that I want to say. But I believe these issues are so important that some repetition will bear doing. As we understand what the constitutional freedom of religion means, the constitutionally guaranteed freedom of religion means, obviously over the years we have had to look at the Supreme Court, because it is that court which finally has determined the interpretation of those clauses. And so I want to review with you very quickly some of the cases that have formed our jurisprudence, formed our understanding of the law about religious freedom. The first case that I need to mention to you took place in 1879. My good friend Jim Wood said it was 1878, but that's no problem. Reynolds versus United States. In Reynolds versus United States, the issue was whether or not a person who was a Mormon who could practice polygamy. Now, the background of all of this that I want to say to you simply is this. As Dr. Wood pointed out to you, it is simply not the case under our system of law that anything can be done in the name of religion. Even though we have religious freedom, it is the case that it's always theoretically possible that some things can be done in the name of religion that would somehow be harmful to others, to be harmful to one's own self, or to the entire community. And consequently, the cases that I want to talk with you about very quickly this afternoon have to do with the scope of interpretation of the Free Exercise Clause. When may the government intervene, and when must it stay out? And in Reynolds versus United States, having to do with the question of whether or not Mormons could practice polygamy as a feature of their religion, the Supreme Court decided against the Mormons. Brother Reynolds was indeed a polygamist, but the federal Congress had passed a law saying that any plural marriage or bigamy was against federal law, and consequently Reynolds was arrested. And he said, "I am guaranteed by the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment the right to practice my married life the way I want to, because it's a matter of religious belief for me." And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, because the law must step in when the practice of religion has the effect of, in this case, damaging the moral fiber of society. And in that case, the Supreme Court laid out a test called the belief action test. In essence, the court said you can believe anything you want to, as Dr. Wood told us a while ago. You can believe anything you want to, no matter how absurd it may appear to others, no matter how bizarre it may appear to the majority. you have absolute freedom of belief, but you do not have absolute freedom of action. And in fact, any kind of action that the government considers to be harmful or detrimental to society can be interfered with. And so the court did not give the government many guidelines, and in fact gave it a good deal of latitude in how it could interfere with religious freedom. And from 1879 until 1940, that's the way the law stood in this country, with the government being able to have a great deal of latitude in when it could interfere with religious behavior. However, in 1940, in a case called Cantwell versus Connecticut, having to do with Jehovah's Witnesses, the court modified its viewpoint on this issue very much. Without going into all the details of the case, the Cantwells were accused of inciting to riot, disturbing the peace, because they were preaching their faith on the streets of New Haven, Connecticut. And part of their faith at that particular time had some very uncomplimentary remarks to say about Roman Catholicism. And some of the people to whom they spoke were Roman Catholics. And what happened was that the Catholics had these fellows arrested for inciting to riot and disturbing to the peace. And the Cantwells took their case to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the court modified this belief-action distinction that the court had handed down in 1879 by saying that only when religious behavior presents a clear and present danger to society may the government interfere. In other words, what happened in the Cantwell versus Connecticut case was that the Supreme Court of the United States narrowed significantly and considerably the options that government has in interfering with religious behavior, and it broadened the idea of religious freedom. So it seems to me that one way that one can summarize the Cantwell case is to say that after Cantwell versus Connecticut in 1940, in this country, religious freedom was the rule and government interference was the exception. And that's the way the law remained for the next 23 years, from 1940 until 1963. In 1963, a case came before the Supreme Court of the United States entitled Sherbert versus Verner, which involved a Seventh-day Adventist woman. This is, as you may know, the Seventh-day Adventists believe that the proper day of worship is Saturday rather than Sunday. Mrs. Sherbert worked for some textile mills in South Carolina, and their work week was Monday through Friday, and everything was fine. But her employer changed the work week and added Saturday work, and all of a sudden Mrs. Sherbert found herself in a difficult circumstance because she could not violate her religious belief about working on Saturday. And consequently, she went to her employer and said, can you modify your work week in some way? I'd be glad to work evenings or modify my own work habits in some way. And the employer said no. And so Mrs. Sherbert had to quit her job. And she went other places to find employment and was not able to find employment that would accommodate her religious activity. And consequently, she went to the unemployment compensation people of South Carolina and said, I've got to have unemployment compensation because I can't work here anymore. And they said no, because you quit your job, work was available to you, you were not available for work, and consequently you cannot have unemployment compensation. She took her case to the Supreme Court of the United States, and in that case the Supreme Court found in favor of Mrs. Sherbert and against the state of South Carolina, and basically said that the clear and present danger test that I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, in fact, is not the test that we will use from now on. But they used rather what is called a compelling state interest test. And the compelling state interest test in a nutshell is this, that any time the government wants to interfere with religion, with religious behavior, it must show that the government has a compelling interest, that it has a legitimate goal which it must reach, which is so important that it can override religious behavior. And so the Supreme Court in Sherbert versus Verner basically said that the free exercise clause of the First Amendment guarantees the citizens of this nation the free exercise of religion. And although there is the possibility that government may interfere with religious behavior only when the government can show that it has a compelling interest. And that's the way the law stood for the next 27 years. In 1990, in a case called Smith versus, the Oregon Employment Division against Smith, the Supreme Court took a major step back away from the idea of guaranteeing religious freedom. Without going into all the details, It involves a Native American who wanted to take peyote as part of the worship of the Native American church. To oversimplify some, the Native American church uses peyote, which is a mild hallucinogenic drug, as its sacrament. And consequently, Mr. Black, who was an employee of a drug rehabilitation operation, had signed as a condition of his employment the promise not to take drugs. But he went to the Native American church and worshiped with them and took peyote, and when his employer found out about it, he was fired. And he went to the state unemployment people and said, I need an unemployment compensation. And they said, no, because you violated the law. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in a decision written by Justice Antonin Scalia, said that the compelling state interest test no longer applies. That any time you have a law of general applicability, the compelling state interest test no longer applies. What that means is that the government did not any longer have to have a strong reason to interfere with religious behavior. That the government had great latitude once again to interfere with religious behavior. In fact, Justice Scalia and his four colleagues in the majority opinion of that case went so far as to say that the free exercise clause itself cannot be applied to a law of general applicability unless it is joined with some other constitutional principles such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to petition the government, etc. That the free exercise clause of the First Amendment was no longer a freestanding liberty guaranteed to the Americans, to the citizens of this country. It was a major setback for religious freedom in this country, because basically what that decision did was to take us back to 1879 to Reynolds versus United States, which did not really inhibit the government very much at all in interfering with religious behavior. Unfortunately, the Smith case was in control. The Smith case was the law of the land at the time that the tragedy that took place on that hill took place. However, there's good news. And the good news is that on the 9th of November, I believe it was, 13th of November of 1993, President Clinton signed into law a bill called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And the Religious Freedom Restoration Act restores the compelling state interest test. It nullifies, in essence, we hope at least, the Smith case. So that today, again, the rule of law is that the government must show a compelling interest before it can interfere in any way, shape, or form with religious behavior. That is a very quick and oversimplified summary of the law of free exercise of religion in this country. I want to point out to you that there are two themes that run through this. Throughout most of our history, and this is certainly true today, the burden of proof is on the government that it has the right to interfere with religious behavior. If the government observes the law correctly, which is always a big if, is it not? The burden of proof is on the government to show that it has a legitimate interest that would cause it to interfere with religious behavior. I think that we would all agree, and certainly my colleague who spoke here just before I did made it abundantly clear, that the government in this situation at Mount Carmel did not actually spell out its burden of proof, but acted precipitously and incorrectly and illegally in violating the religious freedom of the people who lived on that hill. But that's one theme. The idea is that the government is limited by the Bill of Rights of this Constitution, that the government is limited by the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, and the burden of proof is always against the government to show that it has a legitimate interest before it can interfere with religious freedom. The other theme that I want to point out to you simply is this, that throughout the cases that I have mentioned to you and some cases that I have not mentioned to you, the people involved have been the following: Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Amish, members of the Native American Church, people who have been on the margin of what society considers to be legitimate religion. People who somehow or other have been marginalized by the society and have oftentimes been thought of as being strange or peculiar or perhaps even crazy or kooky. But the history of constitutional law in this country, on the free exercise clause at least, is that it is those people who have been the heroes. It is those people who have been on the firing line. It is those people who have gone to the mat. It is those people who have risked life, limb, and property in order to guarantee for all of us, mainstream religious people, people who do not believe in religion at all, the right to be religious or not religious, and if we're religious, the right to be religious the way we want to be. It has been those people that the main society and the media have considered to be the strange, the peculiar, the marginal, who have really guaranteed for all of us the religious freedom that we have. I'm convinced that as the tragic events that took place on this property a year ago become ever more widely known, as more scholarly work is done to try to find out exactly what happened here, the Branch Davidians will take their places with the Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the others who are thought of as the people who have done heroic work, who gave their lives, literally in this case, and their property to guarantee religious freedom for the rest of us. And so let us think today and in the week that comes as we observe the tragic events that happened here, that we live in a great country in many ways because we enjoy religious freedom that is unprecedented in the world. And yet we live in a country in which it is possible for the government to abuse its power, for the government to sometimes not live up to the responsibilities that it has to provide a legitimate argument or a burden of proof. Consequently, as our founding fathers said as they wrote the Constitution, the price of liberty is always eternal vigilance. Let us be rededicated by our presence here today and by what happened up on that hill. Let us be rededicated to try to preserve religious liberty in this country and to try to insist that our governmental officials play only the limited role that they are entitled to play by the Constitution. Thank you very much.
Now you know why I called him Mr. PhD. You know, right after we took the break here, I got to tell you something. Right after we took the break here at about 1 o'clock, a news camera came over to me, one of the television stations. I think it was one of the local Waco stations. And he said, "Well, what are you up to?" And I said, "Not much." He said, "Are you working?" And I said, "No." I said, "I've had a very difficult time finding a job since I left KGBS." He said, "Well," he said, "I know what you did there for 51 days, and I know what you did until the day you left." He said, "Would you do it all over again?" And I said, "You're damn right I would, in a minute." I said, "Because the media wouldn't do it. Somebody had to say that there were two sides to this story, and the media obviously wasn't showing both sides." I said, "Now you're hearing for the first time here today from people that were actually there when it happened, were in there during the siege, didn't leave until the fire. You're finding out the truth. The trial brought out some of the truth." And I said, "But the media still doesn't want to believe it." I said, "Yeah, I'd do it again. I'd do it again in about a half a second." We heard so many things during those 51 days. We heard that the Branch Davidians were in a very heavily fortified compound, that David Koresh was hiding behind his children. And I read a book entitled A Mountain of Lies, and it's a book about what happened in Ruby Creek, Idaho with Randy Weaver. And in that book there are a number of quotes from newspapers quoting ATF and FBI agents. And those are two verbatim quotes that were also in Ruby Creek, Idaho. Randy Weaver's up there in a very heavily fortified compound. He's up there hiding behind his children. They didn't bother telling us that they had killed his son and killed his wife. But that tooth came out in the trial, so with any luck, sooner or later, truth will out. Let's just pray that it's sooner than later. You know, there are an awful lot of ramifications of what took place right here at Mount Carmel. We don't know all of what they are, but I'd now like to introduce you to a gentleman that's the professor of religion at the University of Kansas. His name is Dr. Tim Miller. Tim?
If you're lucky enough to have a program here, you'll see a name on there, James Lewis. I don't have one, but it comes on there somewhere. And I am here because James Lewis is not here. He's had an illness problem and wasn't able to make it, which is really unfortunate for all of you because it would be better if he were here than me. He's eloquent and he knows the territory very thoroughly. 2 or 3 years ago, back before the siege, he believed that alternative religions, slightly unconventional religions, weren't getting a very fair shake in this country. He started an organization called the Association of World Academics for Religious Education with the specific goal of trying to communicate honest information to the general public in place of the great misinformation that seems to be so common. And a group like the Branch Davidians were very much within the kind of thing he was working on. So it would have been wonderful if he personally could have been here because he has a tremendous wealth of information and I'm sure would be able to tell you far more of interest story that I think illustrates enough the whole siege and standoff and an even larger tragedy that suffering because the American public has become that comes into the public eye in a major way. Lots of innocent people suffer completely unjustly. Well, I got interested in that and tried late last summer to check something in that vein out. As many of you know, the Branch Davidians are only one part of a larger Davidian movement that goes back to the settlement down there and some thousands of members altogether. But after the siege of Waco, you can imagine, as someone who teaches in the area of religious studies, I became quite interested in this question. What is the spin-off for other Davidians? What is going to happen to other people who carry this name, which now carries such dangerous, terrible connotations? So I decided I would like to go visit them as a relatively sympathetic observer and just see for myself so I could tell people that there's a larger story of what are these people doing. So I wrote a polite, lengthy letter to the president of the Basham Hill, Exeter, Missouri, Davidian Adventist Fellowship. It has a long name. And explained what my purpose was, and I thought was quite, I thought everything would do them good. I thought my visit would be helpful to them, that by being there I would somehow help them show that they are not, because we have no reason to believe there's anything whatsoever out of line about what they're doing, and I expressed that to him. After a couple of weeks, I got a letter back from the fellow who's president down there. He sent me my own letter back, actually, and across the bottom he wrote in one line, he said, "We're very busy, no time for visitors." Well, I thought, now that's interesting. A group with thousands of members is so busy they don't have any time for visitors. And I am not one to be put down easily and quietly, I guess. And I thought, well, any group that big, you know, just better count on the fact they're going to be visitors. So I'm going down that way anyway. In a few weeks, I'll just go take a look for myself. I'll just drive up and see what they say. So I went down there and found the little crossroads town of Exeter and went into the grocery store and after some inquiry found someone who knew where they were and got these elaborate directions. You go out this way and there's this corner's not marked, but you take a dirt road down to the south and you better clock it pretty carefully. It's about 1.8 miles, and make sure you take the right turn there. And it's one of those kind of classic Ozark windy roads through the hills scenes. Anyway, I went down there and I spent over an hour looking for it. The guy in the grocery store had warned me. He said they took their sign down not too long ago. Well, I spent an hour driving around looking for this other group, and I couldn't find them. And I looked everywhere that could possibly be within the range, I thought. They'd actually, the conclusion is, of course, that they had made themselves deliberately very scarce. They were getting so much hostility just from having that name Davidian that they had basically done their most perfect job of dropping out of view altogether. And my only message here today is that I think that's tragic. There is a larger spin-off. Innocent people are hurting all over the place. Religious tolerance, religious freedom, things that a lot of us think are absolutely crucial to American life, are taking it on the chin. I'm sad to report that.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker comes to us from Lamar University in Beaumont. He's a professor of sociology and criminal justice there. His name is Stuart Wright. Dr. Wright would like to address the justice implications of the Mount Carmel raid. Dr. Wright.
One day after the April 19th fire, President Clinton walked out on the White House lawn and asked the following questions to the press. He said, "Is there something else we should have done? Is there some other question we should have asked? Can I say for sure we could have done nothing else to make the outcome different?" I want to suggest that in the order in which those questions were asked, the answers are yes, yes, and yes. I am at the tail end of a year's worth of research in which we're closing out a book commissioned by the University of Chicago Press. 15 scholars from all over the country, historians, sociologists, scholars in law and in religion, are working on different aspects of the Branch Davidian conflict. And we're trying to work through some of these issues. And the conclusion among my peers is that the series of errors and miscalculations probably could have been stopped or interrupted at any point, and the final outcome of what occurred was not just one mistake, not just two mistakes, not just three miscalculations, but a whole series of miscalculations that are very confounding to those of us who study marginal or alternative religious movements. I'll avoid the word cult because I think it's a pejorative term that people use to beat up on groups they don't like. A cult is a group that you don't like. Basically, that's what we're left with in terms of the definition. One of the things I do want to address in specifics is the method of psychological warfare that the FBI decided to employ about 10 days into the standoff. We now know from the government reports, the Justice Department report and the Treasury Department report, that the FBI gave up on negotiations very early on in the whole process. That's confounding and puzzling to a lot of us. During the same time in which the Branch Davidians were engaged in negotiations with the FBI negotiators, we successfully negotiated a peaceful settlement in Ohio for a prison riot. And it seems to me that the prisoners got a better shake in the situation than the Branch Davidians got. They were so successful in Ohio, and one wonders why we were so miserably unsuccessful here in Waco, Texas. The psychological warfare tactic, which basically was an option that supplanted, it took the place of in negotiations, I think contributed largely to the outcome of April 19th. If you know anything about psychological warfare and pressure tactics, and perhaps you don't, the idea is to destabilize a group by sending them mixed messages, by confusing the message that is being sent, to basically send them into sort of a mental state of chaos, so that you get alternating methods or tactics or messages of threat and conciliation, coercion and conciliation. So that one day the FBI's attitudes will be very conciliatory, sympathetic rather, apologetic, extending themselves to be friends and ameliorative. And the next day they would be aggressive and coercive. They would send tanks out to smash the cars, the automobiles, or the kids' motorcycles and so forth. This was by design. And the result they got was that those inside didn't know who they were dealing with. They couldn't possibly trust those on the outside. They didn't know what to expect from the government. It's not surprising that they expected to be killed by the government. And that is, I think, to some extent, a direct result of the methods that the FBI chose to use. No one has explained to me why they thought that would produce a positive outcome. We know that in some other situations against terrorist groups, perhaps this has been used successfully. One case was cited with Manuel Noriega, but I don't think the analogy or the comparison is a very good one. As Lawrence Sullivan said in his report to the Justice Department, he was one of the panelists at Harvard who was asked to review the actions of the FBI. He said they totally ignored the fact that this group was religious, that their motivations were religious, that their thinking was religious, that they were a religious group, because the FBI dismissed their religion as a front, as a con, and that basically they were a criminal group who used religion as a front. So we have a logic which has a lot of flaws, which probably helps to complicate the matter, and probably contributed to the outcome, because the group thought themselves to be under attack and to be victims in this situation. Let me say just one more thing, and I'll cease. Nancy Ammerman, who was one of the Justice Department's experts asked to review the actions of the FBI, is a good friend of mine, and right after I found out she was chosen to be on this panel, I called her up and I said, "Nancy, how is it that you were selected? No offense, but I don't really consider you to be an expert on new religious movements or apocalyptic sects or these kinds of groups. Nancy studies Southern Baptists. She has 2 books out, both on Southern Baptists. And I said, either the FBI thinks that Southern Baptists are a cult, or they're not able to make a distinction between Southern Baptists and Branch Davidians. She laughed and she said, I'm not quite sure why they picked me, but I got a phone call one day, and Philip Heyman, the assistant secretary, deputy under Reno, asked me if I would participate. And she said, well, I don't think I'm really the person you need to talk to. Let me give you a list of people who I know are scholars, who have spent their whole lives studying these kinds of religious movements. They would be in a better position to make an evaluation. And Philip Heyman said, well, we're only interested in getting you, and if you're not interested, we already have our own list, and we'll go to the next person on the list. And Nancy said she thought about it for a while and decided that she would go ahead and agree to be on the list, because they would exclude the very people that needed to be on the list. And at least she had contact with the people who she thought could be most helpful. And so we talked, and in fact she's got a chapter that will appear in my book, and it's rather revealing about the internal dynamics of the FBI culture. And I can tell you that there's a lot of dissensus within the FBI, sort of an internal warfare between the tactical people who like to go in with guns and solve their problems in military fashion, and those who would prefer to negotiate. And you know who won that internal conflict, the tactical people, and that's why we had the outcome that we did. Thank you.
As you can tell, there's tent right behind you here, and the people in that tent came out here on their own, at their own expense, set up these microphones, the sound system, and the cameras, the TV cameras, as well as they're doing an audio tape of this entire program, audio and video. And the tapes are for sale right behind you here if you'd like a tape of this program so that you might be able to remember exactly what went on. If your memory is anything like mine, you need the tape. And they have audio tapes and also videotapes. The audio tapes will be available immediately today. The videotapes, they'll put you on a mailing list and see that you get your tape. Referring back to my radio program once again, I was on my way to work one morning in March, and I heard a gentleman come on the air on KRLD radio. I had a 1-hour drive to work, and it was a nice way for me to learn what had gone on overnight while I was asleep so that I might be able to update myself by the time I got to the radio station at 7 o'clock, and I went on the air at 9. And I heard this gentleman on the air there, and his name was Phil Arnold. And I remembered he was with the Reunion Institute in Houston, Texas. And I thought, this guy obviously had listened to what David Koresh had said and understood what he said and wasn't putting David Koresh's 58-minute speech, was not calling it a piece of dribble like so many of the news media were calling it, primarily because they was, I guess, too stupid to understand what it meant. Not that I understood what it meant either, but Phil Arnold did. So I called Phil Arnold and I asked him if he'd come on the program. And I had him on the air and then contacted Phil later on in March, and he said, I've got an idea. He said, a very good friend of mine is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina. He said, how about if this professor and myself get together and put together a half-hour program, and we'll air it on your show because we all know that David Koresh listens to the show. And I said, that'd be a great idea. So Phil Arnold got in touch with Dr. Jim Tabor, the PhD that I was speaking about, and Dr. Tabor and Phil Arnold on my program did a 1.5-hour show on the religious aspects of the book of Revelations and trying to find out which seal we were in, if we were in fact in the 5th seal or the 6th seal or the 1st seal. And it was a very, very interesting 30-minute program. So interesting, in fact, that Dick DeGuerin called me and asked me if he could have a copy of it because he wanted to take a copy of it into David Koresh. David had asked for one. The FBI also called me and asked me if I would give them a copy of it. I did. I gave the FBI, and I gave the FBI agent, Clint Van Zandt was his name, and we met right outside TSTC one Sunday morning. And gave him the tape, and I also gave a copy of the tape to Dick DeGuerin. Dick DeGuerin took that tape in and did, in fact, give it to David Koresh. But right now, I'd like to introduce you to the gentleman that was half of that broadcast on my radio station, Dr. James Tabor, I'm sorry. He was involved in the negotiations concerning David Koresh and the end of the siege. Dr. Tabor.
Well, professors don't usually carry Bibles, do they? You want a lecture or a sermon? Okay. Why are people here? I admire, for whatever many reasons that people have come, you people sitting out here in this sun listening to all these speeches, I find it moving. And I want to start actually with something from the scriptures. I want to tell you about the first Koresh. You know, there was a Koresh before David Koresh. I'm not talking about somebody in Florida. I'm talking about somebody in the 6th century BC. His name was Cyrus. But Jews were killed by Babylonians in the year 586, and they wrote a lot of the Psalms lamenting what happened. And I want to read you 2 passages and then comment on them. Psalm 79. O God, the nations have come into your inheritance. They have defiled your holy place. They've laid it in ruins. They've given the bodies of your servants to the birds of the air for food, and the flesh of your faithful to the wild animals of the earth. They poured out their blood like water, and there was no one to bury them. We've become a taunt to our neighbors, mocked and derided by those around us. How long, O Lord, how long? And the other passage is from the same period, the book of Isaiah. Now, Isaiah lived through this period as sort of an eyewitness to the calamities of his time. He saw a lot of people die. He saw dead bodies in streets. He saw corpses. Here's what he wrote. The righteous perish, and no one takes it to heart. The devout are taken away, while no one understands. For the righteous are taken away from calamity, and they enter into peace. Those who walk uprightly rest in their graves. But as for you, the living, come here. You children of a sorceress, you offspring of an adulterer and a whore, whom are you mocking? Now it sounds like Isaiah was a person who had kind of a sharp tongue. To call someone not S-O-B, but the son of a whore. Who is this whore? Why is this kind of a language in the Bible? You see, what happened in the 6th century B.C. is that a very powerful governmental force came into the little country of Judea and absolutely devastated it. These Psalms that I'm reading, Psalm 79 and also Isaiah 56, are written as accounts of the aftermath of that. You heard how they mention dead bodies and corpses and fire, and how they talk about the dead resting, and there's sort of a feeling of bitterness. There are two sharply divided sides here. On the one hand, there's a group that thinks they're the righteous. On the other hand, there's a group that this group is calling the sons of a whore, of an adulterous woman. Now, if you go to the New Testament, a lot of people don't read the book of Revelation. You know what the book of Revelation is actually about in a word? It's about a worldwide repeat in a large, grand scale of that smaller event that took place in Judea in the 6th century B.C. In other words, the ancient Babylonian Empire came into Judea and devastated it. And the book of Revelation, if you've read it, just take chapter 18, chapter 19, Babylon has fallen, and so forth, is about the Babylonians coming, a different Babylonian at the end of days, and conquering the people that consider themselves the righteous. Now, Koresh was Cyrus, king of Persia. And he's addressed in Isaiah 45, and he's told, go take vengeance on those Babylonians. In other words, go punish them for what they did to these children and these women and these innocent people in the siege of Jerusalem. Now, all that is ancient history, but that's the backdrop, actually, to some of the scriptures that David Koresh was most interested in. Now, here's the strange thing about David Koresh. Some of you know this, some of you don't. David could sit here in Waco, Texas, near Elk, and I'm not putting it down, but frankly, this is not Jerusalem. The whole world was not here. There were some FBI and ATF agents, but there's only a handful of people here, 100 or so, that were eventually killed, maybe 87 of them. How could that be the fulfillment of the book of Revelation? Isn't the book of Revelation too grand for that? Isn't it too sweeping for that sort of thing? And so not only did people hear lots of things about David in terms of him being a disreputable person, a child abuser, a sexual pervert, but they also heard that he's fairly crazy, because how could a young Texas boy, relatively uneducated, be claiming that around his people and around the issues of this place right here where we are right now are cosmic kind of major things going on directly mentioned in the Bible, you see? And that's what he actually claimed. Now, I'm not here actually to even pass judgment on that. I'm here to maybe shed some light on it in this sense. If you want to understand what happened here, there are people here for all kinds of reasons. Maybe mostly good, I hope. I don't think most people would come here unless they had some sort of feeling for what went on in a sympathetic sense. But what actually went on here from the standpoint of the students of the Seven Seals, who really don't even call themselves Branch Davidians, from what I understand, they came to study with David. What do they all say, if you know them? What do they all say about why they study with David? Every single one of them. Ask them. Some of them are here today. They say that David Koresh was able to go through the Bible, books like Haggai, Nahum, Habakkuk, books that nobody reads, really. Who reads them? I'm not going to, get personal. Have you read them? Have I read them? Ron hadn't read them. Where's Ron? But he's over there. But see, David was able, to these people's satisfaction, to show them that something was going on, as they said, line by line, precept by precept, here a little, there a little, that was actually unlocking the whole key to the entire Scriptures. Now, I've devoted 30 years of my life to the professional study of the Scriptures, and I found myself drawn into this. David wanted to talk to religious scholars, right? Now, here I am. I have a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. I know the Bible pretty well. I would have loved to have talked to David. I would have loved to have had nice conversations with him and really got into it with him. Now, think of this situation in terms of the religious aspect of it, because no matter why you're here, the reason it actually happened had to do with a message. That is, why would those people not come out? If you've watched the videos that were made inside, they all say, we're convinced that David was able to unlock the Scriptures and is in touch with God, and therefore we're not coming out until God says that we should come out. Right? That was their position. Now, were they just stubborn, or were they naive, or were they ignorant? Why wouldn't they come out? The public wondered. Because from their standpoint, here's this wacko, you heard all the jokes, kind of crazy guy who is babbling all this Bible stuff, Nahum and Haggai, and I'm a ravenous bird from the east, and my name is Koresh. What does all this mean? People don't normally get into these things. This is line by line. This is word by word, going from Isaiah 40, 41, 42, 43, line by line. What does this mean? What does this mean? What about this word? Where else is this found? Now, people would spend 15 hours studying. Why? Because they were a captive audience? No, because they got fascinated. They got hooked into the text. See, what the world did not understand, that the power of this whole thing had to do with people who had grown up believing the Bible had the truth in it, and here was a man, David Koresh, that had finally shown us what the Bible actually says in the greatest detail. For example, what does Daniel 11, verse 44 really mean? Well, most people would say, who can find it? I hadn't read it lately. He would say, what does Revelation 10, verse 4 mean? Who is that messenger who's going to reveal all the mysteries and secrets of the Bible? Or should we just throw this book out? Now look at where I found myself then. I find myself as a biblical scholar, not being allowed directly to talk, but wanting to talk, and through these tapes, as Ron said, and Arnold, dialoguing with this person who had a completely different training. He didn't go to the University of Chicago. He didn't speak Hebrew and Greek as I do. So what is it? Now, at first I thought, well, it's kind of a delicate thing, we know more than David, and we'll just try to kind of, not con him out, but, talk, I don't want to say down to him, but, he couldn't know what we know. But as we began to talk to Livingston, Fagan, and so on, we realized that David did have something. Now, I'm not here actually to endorse David's message. I'm trying to shed some light on why what happened. It didn't happen because of religious freedom, First Amendment rights, any of that stuff that people are rightfully interested in. It didn't happen because the government shouldn't have planned the 28 raid, February 28th. I mean, it did and it didn't. But it wasn't about that. What it was actually about was this, quote, uneducated Texas kid who claimed he could explain every word in the King James Bible. I was intrigued with that, you see. Now, where did we get with David? Really nowhere. We couldn't talk to him. But we did begin to open up some things, and you can talk to David Thibodeau and so on. David appreciated us because at least we were listening. We were saying, David, what are you really saying? You know, we've got text, you've got text, let's get into it, you see? And we did that. That's the setup. Now, why did I start with this first Koresh? The ancient one, Cyrus, king of Persia. Because you read those texts, they're so stark, they're so right and wrong. On one side is the son of a whore, on the other side are the righteous that are slain and their bodies left for animals to eat. Now, the Bible's that kind of book. Do you know if you open the book of Revelation, it's that way too? Are there 2 sides in the book of Revelation? Are there 3 sides, 4 sides, or 5 sides? There are 2 sides, right? There is a war with the Lamb, and there is the beast. Who's in the middle? Nobody, you see? Now, I am not here to tell you that over there in those ruins were the righteous, and here were the wicked, or reverse it. The wicked, the child perverter, the sex maniac was in there, and the righteous, our culture, was out here. In other words, who is Babylon? Now, I have my opinions, and if you're real smart, you can probably figure out where I stand. But that isn't what I came to do, to lambaste the government and say David was right and, you know, preach his gospel or something. I'm trying to come here to say that the only way to deal with him as a culture or as a government or as, quote, negotiators, which I really wasn't, was to talk about the Scriptures. That's why those people were there. That's why those people died. Those people died because they believed David had unlocked the truth of the Holy Bible that our country essentially was founded upon. That's why they died. They died for a noble cause. Now, if they're wrong, they are to be pitied but not hated. I would call them naive, maybe even foolish. People have believed a lot of things that were wrong, I suppose, in history and died for them. Now, if you go back in the ancient times, when the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem, they wrote Psalm 79 and Isaiah 59. We're reading their side of it, and what did they say? They've come in, they've burned our place, they've killed our children, they've left us as prey, they are the wicked sons of the whore, and we are the righteous, and God is going to judge this world. That's the perspective that David took up. Now, why did I start there? Because I want you to see that the perspective of the Branch Davidians, right or wrong, is an ancient perspective, not a new perspective. Somebody talked about a new religious movement. The perspective of a minority group facing the Babylonians goes back to Abraham. And then the text I read, and all the way through, and even the book of Revelation. You see? It's a long history. Your job is to decide which side is right if you have any interest in the Bible. Now, you know, 3 things were done wrong here. The pressure and the harassment was wrong. And wrong, I mean it wouldn't work. If you pressure and harass a religious group that says, we are the righteous people of God and you are the wicked Babylonians who have killed our people, what would that pressure do? I mean, let's ask a grade schooler. Would that make them weaker or stronger? See? What did Jesus of Nazareth say? The Beatitudes. Blessed are you when people revile you. What did he say about himself? They will spit upon me and reject me and say all manner of evil, you see, against me. Okay? So pressure and harassment was wrong. This wasn't a hostage, barricade, rescue situation. This was a group of Bible students that were attacked by the ATF for alleged violations of some firearms laws on February 28th. These are people that took the communion twice a day, the Lord's Supper. Who does that? These are people who read the Bible for hours, who had every line marked, every word, and thought they were right. As far as I'm concerned, the only way to deal with them is approach it on that level, and that's what Philip and I tried to do. So the pressure and harassment were counterproductive. The vilification, saying David is wicked and evil, what do you think that does to the inside? Even if they were wrong, what does it do? It just solidifies them, right? Blessed are you when they say all manner of evil against you. In other words, even on a tactical level, everything done was stupid in terms of a dedicated religious group. It was the opposite. And finally, the attack on the 29th was the worst of all. Why? Because sticks and stones can break my bones, right, but words can never hurt me. Well, CS gas is the sticks and stones, and tanks coming in. Now, what was David doing the night before the tanks came in? We're talking about April 19th, maybe about 9 in the evening. He had written this letter on Wednesday. Sunday night, he was working on this manuscript. If you read this letter in which he does mention Philip and me and talks about giving us the copy of it, which at least showed he had enough of respect for us to think we would read it, you know, and maybe comment intelligently on it and say, well, this does, you know, say something. This is an incredible letter. I think we even have copies if some of you don't have it. But if you don't have this letter, this is the last sort of living communication of David Koresh. It's an incredibly interesting letter from any standpoint. But among other things, he says that he is going to be given over into the hands of men, that he's coming out, he's going to be arrested. He worked it out with DeGuerin and Zimmerman. He was coming out. And he says, I know that I will be made a spectacle of, and people will be concerned about the truth, not be concerned about the truth of God, but the bizarrity of me in the flesh. I think that's fairly perceptive. Do you think the Current Affair would have wanted maybe an interview from jail with David Koresh? And would they have asked him about Isaiah 59 verse 3 and what that might mean? Or would they have asked him about what? Are we talking sex, drugs, and rock and roll? Or are we talking scriptural exegesis? David knew that. Fairly intelligent comment here. He says, I thank my Father that he's granted me the chance to do this. I thought David thought he was God. Do you realize that Edward Dennis on October 8th, summarizing the entire FBI Justice Department investigation, here was his final sentence, press conference, October 8th. In the final analysis, we simply didn't know what to do with a man who thought he was God. Now that's interesting. That shows, I don't want to be sarcastic, but why not? That shows some real in-depth study of David's teaching. Here he says, I thank my Father. I wonder who that might be then. If he's God, then who is he thanking? And, you know, who is Yahweh? You know, Jehovah, and so forth. You know why they thought he was God? Because he adapted the prophecies of Isaiah, where Isaiah says, thus says the Lord, and then he goes, I will do this, I will do this, I will do this. And David would write that, say, look, it says, I will do this, I will exercise my wrath upon Babylon. That thus says the Lord. David wrote it, therefore he thinks he's God. If you read any of it, he says, and you should listen to my servant David. I wonder who that was. In other words, this is really interesting, isn't it? Here David is thanking his father, but he's supposed to be the father, or, you know. And then he says, I will do this, but listen to my servant David. Maybe that was David Thibodeau. You think that could have been David Thibodeau? You see what I'm saying? Nobody was reading this stuff carefully. Did anybody sit down and really say, now, what is this man trying to say? Now, he says, I'm working night and day, and, you know, so forth. Now, on the day of the fire, Jeff Jamar said, we have absolute evidence. He's the head of the FBI operation here. We have absolute evidence, absolute. He said it on Nightline, he said it on Larry King, and he said it on a couple of the network news. Absolute evidence that David was not working on the manuscript. Many of you have a copy of the manuscript, right? And we know even who typed it and when it was typed, and he was working on it, right? Now, you want to know the last words of David Koresh that are recorded at least? They're pretty interesting. Look at the last page of the manuscript. You know what he says? He quotes Joel. Gather the bridegroom, gather the children, assemble the people, let them come out of their closet. And then he gives a commentary on it. This is what he often did. He quotes the scripture and then he explains it, applies it as he understood it. And I don't have it with me, but I can paraphrase it. He says, isn't it time for us to come out and be revealed to the world as those who love Christ in righteousness? Those are his last words. Sunday night, about 9:30 in the evening. Now what happened the next morning then? David was trying to figure out what God wanted the whole time. Now, let's say that you decided God wanted you finally to reveal your message to the world. You will go to jail and let everybody say what they want, but you got the message. That's what he had decided, and we had worked with him on that. You know, why don't you separate yourself from the message? He agreed. He's going to do that. Dick DeGuerin and Jack Zimmerman had worked out all the legal things. It was worked out. He was coming out, you see? Now, he thought, God wants that, right? I'm going to do it. He said, I thank God, I'm going to do it. If tanks come next morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, and start knocking holes in, what do? Do you get out your computer, say, oh, I think I will today write the second seal of the manuscript. This must be what God wants me to do as you're looking out the hole and tear gas is coming in? No, what do you decide? You decide, I guess God didn't want the manuscript to be written. Why? Because he's allowing this to happen. This is how David thought. He didn't have it all written out. He had a general idea of what was supposed to happen, but not the specifics. I've got tapes of him in '85, and he says all this is supposed to take place in Israel, in another country even. But then when he got attacked here, he began to think, well, maybe it's supposed to be here, you see? Now that was the variation, that was the variable. David was coming out. His last words are, I'm coming out. His last letter says, I'm working night and day on this manuscript. That's the triple tragedy of this thing. The first thing, February 28, should have never happened. That's where we start, right? 51 days, tragedy number 2, you harass and vilify somebody and pressure them, and where do you get? Well, where we got. And the third big mistake, going on April 19th, when he said, all I'm waiting for 51 days is my word from God. Do you understand what this is? Here goes my... Actually, these notes have nothing on them. They're just papers. This is, according to David, his word from God. Read it. So, what am I saying? I'm saying 2 things in summary. First, this is not new. You choose your side. I'll choose my side. I'll decide who I think the Bible allegorically refers to as the Babylonians. You decide who you think. I'll decide who I think are the righteous. You decide what you think. So I'm not going to tell you that. That's up to you. But I'm telling you, it's not a new conflict, it's an old conflict. Martyrs, Jews, Gentiles, Christians, throughout the ages. My name is James Tabor. Have you ever heard of the Taborites? What happened to the Taborites? They're not my followers. But they lived in Bohemia in the year 1516, and they went up on a mountain, and guess what happened to them? They were burnt out and all killed. What were they? Radical Reformation types that said, let's go back to the Bible and so on. So maybe I have this in my blood, you think? Anyway, the point is, this is an old story. The old story is that the authorities confront the minority and choose you this day, as Joshua said, which side is which, you see? That's not what I'm here to tell you. But that's my first point. Second point is, if you want to deal with it, I could have said everything I did and did everything I did, whether I took sides or not, as far as Mount Carmel. In other words, all we were talking about finally is how do you communicate with somebody? Do you say, nah, 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 or come out with your hands up, or you better come out or I'll run over your car, or I'll shoot your dog, or I'll moon your kid? Does that really do anything to a religious group that takes the Holy Communion in the morning and in the evening every day? Is that going to make them, oh, we better go out to those people? Doesn't, see? So it didn't really matter what side I was on. All Philip and I were saying is let's communicate on the only level David ever wants to communicate. If any of you ever talked to David, I bet the Bible was brought up, was it not? I bet even if you went fishing with him. I don't know, I never went fishing with him, but I think I've heard him say, you know, let's go fishing. We can talk about Isaiah 53 or something, you know. This is David. So anyway, that's my position. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Sad, sad, sad. Bad, bad, bad.
Jim Tabor just talked about a letter that he and Phil Arnold got from David Koresh. David Koresh also wrote me a letter. He wrote me a letter, well, actually it was a note, on March 28th, and asked Dick DeGuerin to bring it out and give it to me. And the letter basically said, this portion of the letter was written by Dick DeGuerin. It said, "Dear Ron, would you please help my attorney Dick DeGuerin obtain any videotape you possibly can of the initial raid that took place on March the 28th. Then there was a line on there, and underneath that line, Dick DeGuerin had printed the name David Koresh. David Koresh signed it, dated it March 28th, 1993. And then under that, he wrote in his own handwriting to me, said, "Dear Ron, thanks for your fair concern in our matter. May our constitutional forefathers arise from the dead and kick butt." Dick DeGuerin brought that note out, and I got the note, as I mentioned, when I took the tape from Doctors Phil Arnold and Jim Tabor down to him after April the 1st. Only Dick DeGuerin gave me, he let me read it, and then he took it with him and said I couldn't have it because he may need it for a court case that was coming up. I understood that. Then after David and 85 or 86 others died here on April the 19th, about, I don't know, a month or two after that, I contacted Dick DeGuerin and I said, "Look, Dick," I said, "I'd like that letter that belongs to me from David Koresh." And he said, "Well, I thought I gave you a copy of it." And I said, "No," I said, "I don't want a copy of it. I want the letter." I said, "The letter was written to me, signed by David Koresh." I said, "It belongs to me, and I'd like you to give it to me." I still haven't gotten the letter. I don't know if I will or not. Of course, Dick DeGuerin could probably afford a hell of a lot more attorney fees than I can, being that he is an attorney and it won't cost him anything. But I would certainly like to get that original letter from David that was written to me. And I don't know if it'll ever happen. And it's because I just want the letter. You know, I also have a personal letter that was written to me by Randy Weaver. And David Koresh wrote a personal letter to Doctors Jim Tabor and Dr. Phil Arnold. And that brings us to the next gentleman I'd like to introduce you to. As I mentioned before we brought up Jim Tabor, was the fact that Jim and Phil had worked together and put together a 30-minute program that was aired on my radio station. And Dr. Phil Arnold, Ph.D., Executive Director of the Reunion Institute, and he's also the Professor of History and Religion at the Houston Graduate School of Theology. Dr. Arnold is vitally concerned with the encroachment of the government into church affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Phil Arnold.
Who wants to lead it? Let Gene go. Go ahead. Yes, sir. Here's
all right. God bless the Republic. Death to the New World